a very advanced city. He left everything for God. God promises him a great blessing. He offers up his most precious son. God called him, "My friend." The knife weighed heavier on him than the entire journey. 3 days on the road, watching his son laugh, eat bread, fall asleep by the fire. And now he was there, binding his hands on a stone altar. The boy did not resist. The old man raised the knife. What happened in the next 3 seconds changed history forever. But the most striking thing is not that a father was willing to sacrifice his son. It is that this same man, who was imperfect just like you and me, attained the greatest privilege a human being can aspire to. God himself called him, "My friend." What did God know that we do not see? To understand how an imperfect man built the most extraordinary friendship in ancient history, we must travel 4,000 years back to a city where the smoke from sacrifices to false gods barely let the sky be seen. 4,000 years ago, in one of the most prosperous cities of the ancient world, that man lived. His name was Abram, which means exalted father. The Bible would later call him Abraham, and centuries later, the prophet Isaiah would record the most extraordinary words God has ever spoken about a human being. "Abraham, my friend." This is the story of how an imperfect man built, step by step, the most amazing friendship in ancient history. The city of stretched out under the scorching sun of Mesopotamia on the banks of the Euphrates River. Its winding streets teemed with life. Merchants haggled loudly in the bazaars, while the aroma of spices mingled with the stench of livestock. Workers spun white wool in open workshops, and stooped slaves unloaded treasures from ships arriving at the river port. The homes of wealthy families had 12 or more rooms arranged around paved courtyards. They had running water, bathrooms, and even a sewer system. Was not a primitive village. It was a sophisticated metropolis. But all that splendor existed in the shadow of a massive ziggurat, a stepped pyramid that dominated the skyline. From its summit, the smoke of sacrifices rose day and night toward the sky. The priests of the moon god, Nana, shouted their chants through the streets. Chapels dedicated to false gods dotted every neighborhood, and in almost every home, except the poorest, there was a private altar for idolatry. Only 10 generations had passed since Noah and his family left the ark. Noah had died just 2 years before Abram's birth, and yet the world had already forgotten the true God. Even Terah, Abram's father, participated in that false worship. According to Joshua 24:2, Terah served other gods. Some historians suggest that he even made idols. Imagine what it meant for Abram to grow up in that home. A young man who had somehow come to know God, surrounded by a family and an entire city devoted to gods of stone and wood. How did Abram learn about the true God? Most likely through Shem, the son of Noah. The lives of Shem and Abram overlapped for about 150 years. Imagine Abram as a child, sitting before the wise, weathered face of that extraordinary old man. Shem's eyes had witnessed more than 400 years of history. The wickedness before the flood, the waters covering the earth, the rainbow as a divine sign, the Tower of Babel, the confusion of tongues. Everything Shem told him was etched into Abram's heart like fire on wet clay. And that is why Abram was different. While his neighbors bowed before the ziggurat, he looked away in disgust. While his own father molded clay figures to worship, Abram flatly rejected idolatry. It wasn't easy. It meant going against the grain of his entire culture, his community, and his own blood. But he did it. In the midst of that spiritual loneliness, Abram found someone who shared his faith, Sarah, a woman exceptional not only for her remarkable beauty, but for her deep devotion to God. They married, and though they could not have children, they served the true God together. They also adopted Lot, Abram's orphaned nephew, welcoming him into their home as a son. And then, one day, something happened that changed everything. The biblical account doesn't give many details about how it happened, but it says that the God of glory appeared to him. Perhaps it was through an angel. Perhaps it was a vision. What we do know is that Abram saw a glimpse of the incomparable glory of the Sovereign of the universe. What a stark contrast between the living God and the lifeless idols that surrounded him. And the message was clear. Leave your country and your relatives and go to the land that I will show you. Let's note something crucial. God didn't tell him where he was going. He simply told him to leave. In the ancient Middle East, abandoning one's family was considered worse than death. And Abram was no longer young. He was about 70 years old, and Sarah was about 60. How many conversations must they have had in the privacy of their home? How many restless nights, weighing what they were leaving behind against what they could not see? They were leaving homes with running water for tents in the desert. They were leaving security for the unknown. But when Sarah told Abram she was willing to go, something clicked. The elderly Terah, who seemed to have abandoned idolatry, agreed to accompany them. Lot joined them as well. Finally, the day arrived. Outside the walls and the moat surrounding the caravan was ready. Donkeys and camels loaded, flocks gathered, servants in formation. All eyes turned to Abram. And then he gave the signal. The caravan moved forward, leaving the city behind them, never to return. Here began the first test, and here Abram demonstrated the first quality that God would value forever: immediate obedience, unconditional, without seeing the full destination. But if Abram's story ended here, it would be inspiring and nothing more. What makes it extraordinary is what comes next. Because over the course of decades, this imperfect man would accumulate trial after trial, mistake after mistake, and act of faith after act of faith, until God spoke to him the words that no other human being in the Bible received. My friend. What did Abraham do to earn that title? And what does that teach us about what God seeks in us? Abram had taken the first step. He had left everything behind to obey God. But that obedience would not protect him from himself. For before the promise begins to be fulfilled, Abram will make a mistake born of fear that will endanger Sarah, the promise, and everything God had given him. The caravan moved slowly but steadily northwest, following the course of the Euphrates. Day after day, week after week, Abram and Sarah grew accustomed to the routine of the journey: a stretch on foot, another riding on the back of a donkey or a camel. Their voices were lost amid the jingle of the animals' bells and the creaking of the loads. Every night they set up camp, and every morning they broke it down. And always, at every stop, they made sure that the elderly Terah traveled as comfortably as possible. After traveling about 960 kilometers, the caravan arrived in Haran, a prosperous city nestled at the crossroads of trade routes between east and west. Abram decided to settle there for a while. Terah was too weak to continue traveling, and here Abram demonstrated another quality that God deeply valued:
love and respect for his father. He did not abandon him. He did not leave him behind to move faster toward the promise. He stayed, and he waited. Years passed in Haran. God blessed Abram during that time. His possessions multiplied, and he acquired servants and livestock. And then, at the age of 205, Terah died. Abram felt the weight of grief. He had lost the man who, with all his imperfections, had accompanied him all the way there. But in the midst of that loss, God spoke to him again, and this time he was more specific. He not only repeated the command to move forward,
but he detailed the blessings. From Abram, a great nation would arise. His name would be made great, and all the families of the earth would be blessed through him. Abram had just buried his father, and the first thing God did was not to demand that he resume his journey. He spoke to him. He repeated the promises in greater detail than before. A renewing and compassionate faithfulness, that of someone who draws near just when the other is at his most broken. How those words must have encouraged him. Abram set out again, now with a much larger caravan. Several days' journey away lay Carchemish, the main crossing point where caravans crossed the Euphrates. And there, probably on the 14th day of the month that would later be called Nisan, in the year 1943 BC, Abram crossed the river. On that day, the covenant between God and Abram came into effect. It was a historic moment that would resonate for centuries. Exactly 430 years later, on that very date, God would deliver the Israelites from Egypt. To the south lay Canaan. Abram traveled to the great trees of Moreh in Shechem, and there God appeared to him again. "To your descendants I will give this land." Abram responded by building an altar. Then he moved on near Bethel and built another. The account says he called on the name of the Lord, which likely meant that he not only prayed, but also proclaimed that name to those around him. In a land populated by Canaanites, Abram set up altars as banners of his faith. Here another quality that God valued is revealed: active gratitude. Abram did not merely receive promises, he celebrated them publicly. Each altar was a declaration: Jehovah is real, and I belong to him. Abram had crossed the river, built altars, and proclaimed his faith in a foreign land. Everything seemed to be going according to God's plan. But the promised land was about to greet him with something he didn't expect. And what he does to survive will reveal that the man of the altars is still capable of lying. But the promised land greeted Abram with an unexpected trial: famine. A severe famine struck Canaan, so severe that Abram had to make a difficult decision. Stay in the land God had promised him and risk everyone's lives? Or seek refuge in Egypt, the agricultural powerhouse that rarely suffered shortages thanks to the Nile? Abram chose the practical option, to take his family south. And here, for the first time in the story, we see the man behind the faith. We see the imperfect human being. As the caravan approached Egypt, Abram looked at Sarah. She was about 65 years old, but her beauty remained extraordinary, and Abram knew it. He also knew how things worked in that land. An ancient papyrus tells of a pharaoh who ordered armed men to take a woman and kill her husband. Abram's fear was not unfounded. If the Egyptians discovered that Sarah was his wife, they would kill him to take her for themselves. And if he died, the line of the promised descendants would be broken. So he said to her, "Please say you are my sister." Technically, it wasn't a complete lie, since Sarah was his half-sister, but it was a calculated deception born of fear. Abram, the man who had left Ur by obeying God's voice,
now resorted to a human stratagem to protect himself. Where was the faith that had led him out of Mesopotamia? And what Abram feared came to pass. The Egyptian princes saw Sarah, praised her before Pharaoh, and she was taken to the ruler's house. Imagine the anguish of that night. Abram separated from his wife, powerless to do anything, knowing that he himself had devised the trap in which they were now caught. Meanwhile, Pharaoh showered the supposed brother with gifts: sheep, cattle, donkeys, male and female servants, camels. Each gift was a bitter reminder of his mistake. But God did not abandon Abram. Although his servant had acted out of fear, God intervened with power.
Severe plagues fell upon Pharaoh's house. Faithful and merciful protection. Abram had walked into that trap on his own out of fear, but God did not wait for him to ask for help. He intervened anyway. The account does not specify how, but the truth was revealed to the ruler. Furious, he summoned Abram. "What is this you have done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Take her and go." Pharaoh ordered that he be escorted out of Egypt with all he possessed. Abram left Egypt richer in possessions, but likely more humble in spirit. He had learned something he might never forget. When he acted by faith, God opened up impossible paths. When he acted out of fear, he created problems that only Jehovah could resolve. In both cases, God demonstrated something fundamental about his character. He did not expect perfection from Abram. He expected a heart that would keep turning back to him. And that is exactly what Abram did. Upon returning to Canaan, he went straight to the place between Bethel and Ai where he had previously built an altar. And there, once again, he called upon the name of the Lord. He did not sink into shame. He did not turn away from God because he had failed. He returned to the altar. He returned to prayer. He returned to faith. Here something profound is revealed about why God would eventually call him friend. Abraham was not a man who never made mistakes. He was a man who always returned. The man who had just lied out of fear in Egypt is about to do something that seems to make no sense. Because when it comes time to choose between keeping the best or giving it all up, Abram will choose to lose it. And that seemingly absurd decision will bring him back more than he ever imagined. If the story of this imperfect man whom God refuses to abandon is touching your heart, subscribe to the channel. What Abram does next will forever change the way we understand generosity. Back in Canaan, Abram faced a new problem. Though this time it didn't come from outside, but from within his own family. God had blessed both Abram and Lot with flocks and herds in abundance. So much abundance, in fact, that the land was no longer enough to sustain both camps together. Abram's herdsmen and Lot's herdsmen began to quarrel over the best pastures and water sources. The tension grew day by day, and if it wasn't resolved soon, it could fracture the family relationship. Now, Abram was the eldest, the patriarch, the head of the family. He had every right to choose first. The customs of the ancient Near East gave him that authority. But what he did next was extraordinary. He approached Lot and said, "Please, let there be no dispute between you and me, or between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brothers. Isn't the whole land before you? Please, separate from me. If you go to the left, I will go to the right, and if you go to the right, I will go to the left." The patriarch yielded the right to choose. The elder gave priority to the younger. Why? Because Abram trusted that God would provide, no matter what portion fell to him. He did not need to fight for the best because his security did not depend on a territory, but on a promise. Lot lifted his eyes. To the east lay the Jordan Valley, a fertile, well-watered plain, green and lush, like the garden of the Lord,
says the Bible. Lot did not hesitate. He chose the best for himself and gradually moved closer until he settled near Sodom. The account adds an ominous detail. The men of Sodom were wicked and great sinners against God. And Abram? He kept what was left. But God responded immediately. As soon as Lot left, God said to him, "Lift up your eyes and look from where you are toward the north, the south, the east, and the west. All the land that you see I will give to you and your descendants." Abram gave up the best without a fight, and God gave him everything he could see in every direction.
Overflowing and disproportionate generosity, always in favor of those who trust in him. Abram's generosity cost him nothing. He gained everything. Here another quality that God values in a friend is revealed: selfless generosity. A friend of God does not fight for his rights. He trusts that God will take care of what he deserves. But Lot's story did not end with that peaceful parting. Sometime later, 4 allied kings, led by the powerful Chedorlaomer of Elam, crushed a rebellion by 5 Canaanite kings. Sodom and Gomorrah were plundered, and Lot, along with his entire family and possessions, was captured and carried off as spoils of war. When the news reached Abram, he did not hesitate for a moment. He did not say, "Lot chose Sodom, let him fend for himself." He did not calculate the risk or weigh the odds. He immediately gathered 318 trained men, slaves born in his own household, and set out on a forced march in pursuit of the invading armies. 300 kilometers to the north beyond Damascus. By nightfall, he divided his men into groups and launched a surprise attack against a vastly superior military force. And with God's help, he prevailed. He rescued Lot, the women, all the people, and recovered all the goods. Upon returning victorious, a remarkable encounter took place. Melchizedek, king of Salem and priest of the Most High God, came out to meet him with bread and wine. He blessed him, saying, "Blessed be Abram by the Most High God, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be the Most High God who has delivered your oppressors into your hand." Moved, Abram gave him 1/10 of everything. But when the king of Sodom offered to keep the spoils, Abram flatly refused. He would not accept even a thread or a sandal strap. He did not want anyone to be able to say that Abram's wealth came from Sodom and not from God. Generosity in peace, courage in war, and after victory, humility to reject human glory and give all the credit to God. 3 more qualities that God was observing in the man he would one day call his friend. So far, Abram seems to have fully recovered from the mistake of Egypt, a generous, brave, humble man. But what follows will reveal that this same man, the one who rejected the spoils of kings, is still capable of making a decision out of impatience whose consequences will be felt for generations. Years passed. Abram had obeyed every instruction, had crossed rivers and deserts, had rejected idolatry, had rescued Lot, had built altars throughout Canaan. But one question gnawed at him from within, a question he could not ignore because God himself had raised it. Where was the promised son? Every divine promise pointed to a descendant, a great nation, blessings for all the families of the earth. But Sarah remained barren, and the 2 of them were growing old, with no hope of change. One night his worry overflowed. Abram laid before God what weighed on his soul. "Sovereign Lord Jehovah, what will you give me, since I have no children, and the one who will inherit my house is Eliezer of Damascus?" A Syrian steward. That was all Abram had as an heir, not a son, a faithful servant. Jehovah's response was immediate and direct. "This man will not be your heir. Rather, one who comes from your own body will succeed you." And then he did something Abram would never forget. He led him out of the tent. The night in the wilderness of Canaan was vast, immense, overwhelming. Without light pollution, the sky was a dense blanket of stars pulsing from one horizon to the other. "Look up at the heavens and count the stars, if you can count them," Jehovah said to him. Abram looked up. Thousands, millions, countless. "So shall your descendants be." He led him out of the tent, as one might take a friend by the arm and say, "Come, let me show you something." That night, Abram discovered he was not speaking to a cold or distant God, but to someone compassionate and close, who responded to his pain with action. And then, the biblical account records something that occurs for the first time in all of Scripture. Abram put his faith in the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. It is the first time the Bible uses this expression. It does not say that Abram understood how it would be fulfilled. It does not say that he stopped having questions. It says that he believed. Period. And God counted that faith as righteousness. That night, under the stars, God formalized a solemn covenant. Abram prepared sacrifices of animals cut in half, and a deep sleep fell upon him. In the thick darkness, the Lord revealed the future to him. His descendants would be strangers in a foreign land for 400 years and would be afflicted. But afterward, God would bring them out with great possessions. Abram was not merely receiving a personal promise. He was looking centuries into the future. That was perhaps the most intimate night between Abram and his God. And the quality God observed was the most fundamental of all: pure faith. Not faith based on visible evidence, but faith that accepts the impossible because it trusts the one who promises it. But what followed showed that even after such a sublime spiritual experience, Abram remained a man of flesh and blood. 10 years had passed since their arrival in Canaan. 10 years without a child. Sarah, who was already 75 years old, made a painful decision. She said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Please, lie with my servant Hagar. Perhaps I can have a son through her." It was an accepted custom in the ancient Near East. It was not a sin, but neither was it the path God had laid out. And Abram agreed. Hagar became pregnant, and immediately everything became complicated. The Egyptian maidservant began to look down on her barren mistress. Sarah, wounded and humiliated, complained bitterly to Abram. He responded by relinquishing authority. "Your maidservant is at your disposal. Do with her as you see fit." Sarah humiliated Hagar so severely that she fled into the desert. By a spring on the road to Shur, the angel of the Lord found Hagar alone, pregnant, a fugitive. He commanded her to return and humble herself before Sarah, but he also made her a promise concerning her son. Hagar returned, and when Abram was 86 years old, Ishmael was born. The human solution had produced a son, yes, but it had also sown pain, conflict, and division within the household. Abram learned once again that rushing ahead of God's plan with his own solutions brings lasting consequences. Impatience, even when born of a legitimate desire, can complicate what God had already resolved. And yet, God did not abandon him. He did not take back his promises. He did not tell him he was no longer worthy of his trust. He continued to deal with Abram, continuing to build with him, step by step, the most extraordinary friendship of the patriarchal era. God did not punish him.
He did not take back his promises. He did not tell him he was no longer worthy. Unwavering and restorative patience, the kind of one who continues to build with someone despite their mistakes. Ishmael was born. But after that birth, something unsettling happened. God stopped speaking to Abram. 13 years of silence. Not a vision, not a message, not a sign. What would have to happen for God to break that silence? And when he finally did, what would he ask of the man who had gone 13 years without hearing his voice? 13 years passed in silence. 13 years without the biblical account recording a single communication between God and Abram. Ishmael was growing up, and perhaps Abram had grown accustomed to thinking that this boy would be the promised heir. But when Abram turned 99, God broke the silence in a way that changed everything. "I am the Almighty God," he told him.
And in that very conversation, he did two profoundly significant things. First, he changed his name. He would no longer be Abram, exalted father, but Abraham, father of a multitude of nations. Every time someone called him by his new name, it would remind him of the promise. Second, he instituted circumcision as a visible and permanent sign of the covenant between them. That very day, Abraham, at the age of 99, was circumcised along with all the men of his household, without delay, without excuses, immediate obedience, just as he had shown the first time in Ur. But then God added something that provoked an unexpected reaction. "Your wife Sarah will bear you a son." Abraham fell on his face and laughed. Not in mockery, not out of defiance. He laughed because the promise sounded humanly absurd. A son at 100 years old? Sarah giving birth at 90? He said in his heart, "Can a son be born to a man 100 years old?" It was a moment of genuine weakness, an instant doubt, a flash of humanity that the Bible does not hide. And God did not punish him for it. He simply confirmed the promise and moved on. Here we see another of Abraham's failings, momentary doubt. But we also see something beautiful about God. A true friend does not cast someone aside because they falter. He gives them time for their faith to recover. Shortly afterward, Abraham was sitting at the entrance of his tent in the sweltering midday heat when he looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. He immediately ran to greet them. He offered them water to wash their feet, shade under a tree, and then prepared a generous meal. Cakes of fine flour, a tender, well-fed calf, butter, and milk. Abraham did not know they were angels in human form. He simply showed the hospitality that was in his heart. As they ate, one of them asked, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" "Here in the tent," Abraham replied. Then came the announcement, "I will surely return to you at this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Sarah was listening from behind the tent curtain, and she laughed to herself. She thought, "After I've withered away, am I going to have pleasure, since my husband is already old?" God, who read her thoughts, said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh? Is there anything too extraordinary for Jehovah?" Sarah, frightened, denied having laughed, but Jehovah replied firmly, "No, you did laugh." Then the atmosphere changed completely. The visitors stood up and turned their gaze toward Sodom, and God did something that reveals the level of trust that already existed between them. He decided not to hide from Abraham what he was about to do. "The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is certainly great, and their sin is very grave," he told him. He was about to destroy those cities. Was the Creator of the universe obligated to consult anyone?
No. But he chose not to hide it from Abraham. Deep and respectful trust, the kind that exists only between true friends. And here Abraham showed astonishing courage. He approached God and said something that few men in history would have dared to utter. "Are you really going to sweep away the righteous along with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous people in the city. Won't the judge of all the earth do what is right?" He wasn't questioning God's justice. He was appealing to it. And God listened. "If I find 50 righteous people in Sodom, I will spare the whole place for their sake." Abraham continued, "What if there are 5 short? What if 40? What if 30? What if 20? Each time he dared a little more, acknowledging his smallness. "Here, please. I have taken the liberty of speaking to the Lord, though I am but dust and ashes," until he reached 10. The Lord agreed once more, and the conversation ended. Abraham had interceded. God had listened. But in all of Sodom, not even 10 righteous people will be found. Judgment would fall.
And someone from Abraham's own family would pay an irreversible price for failing to let go of what he needed to leave behind. Not even 10 righteous people were found in Sodom. Judgment fell. God rained fire and brimstone upon Sodom and Gomorrah. The angels practically dragged Lot and his 2 daughters out by force, pulling them by the hand. Lot's wife looked back and turned into a pillar of salt. Abraham, from afar the next day, looked toward where those cities had been and saw columns of thick smoke rising as if from a furnace. But what matters most about this episode is not the destruction. It is the conversation that preceded it. Abraham interceded for people who did not deserve it. He spoke to God with a frankness that is only possible between friends. And Jehovah listened to him with a patience that only a true friend possesses. That night, the friendship between them grew deeper than ever. The impossible is about to happen. The promise that provoked laughter of disbelief in both Abraham and Sarah will come true. But the birth of that son will not bring only joy. It will spark a conflict within the household that will force Abraham to do something no father wants to do. And then, exactly as God had promised, the miracle happened. Sarah, at the age of 90, became pregnant. Abraham was 100. The promise that had seemed absurd, the very one that had provoked laughter of disbelief in both him and his wife, became flesh and blood in a newborn who cried for the first time under the stars of Canaan. Abraham named him Isaac, which means laughter. But it was no longer the nervous laughter of doubt. It was the overflowing laughter of one who sees the impossible become reality. Sarah expressed it with words that capture all the emotion of that moment. "God has brought me laughter. Everyone who hears of this will laugh with me." 25 years of waiting, 25 years of promises sustained only by faith, and now, at last, he held his son in his arms. Abraham, the man who had left Ur with no destination, who had crossed the Euphrates with no guarantees, who had looked at the stars and believed the unbelievable, now held the first tangible evidence that God keeps every word. Isaac was not just a baby. He was living proof that faith placed in God is never in vain. The following years were probably the happiest in Abraham's life. He watched Isaac grow. He taught him about God, about the altars, about the promises. Around the age of 5, when Isaac was weaned, Abraham prepared a great feast to celebrate. But in the midst of the joy, a problem arose that had been brewing for years. Ishmael, who was already 19, mocked Isaac. It was not an innocent child's game. That mockery targeted the right of inheritance. Who would be the true heir to the promises? Sarah saw this and reacted with a mother's fierceness. "Send this maidservant and her son away, for the son of this maidservant shall not be heir alongside my son Isaac." This hurt Abraham deeply. Ishmael was his son too. He had seen him born, raised him for 19 years, and loved him. The idea of sending him away was unbearable to him. But God intervened directly. "Do not be distressed about the boy. Listen to everything Sarah tells you, for it is through Isaac that your descendants will be counted. And as for the son of the maidservant, I will also make a nation of him, for he is your descendant." Early the next morning, Abraham gave Hagar bread and a skin of water and sent them away. Imagine the silence of that early morning. The father watching his eldest son walk away into the desert, a lump in his throat, teary eyes. But his feet were steady, because he had learned, after so many trials, that obeying the Lord, even when it hurts, always leads to something better. And here Abraham demonstrated a quality that few mention when they speak of faith: the ability to let go, to give up what he loves when God asks it of him, not out of indifference, but out of trust. Letting go of Ishmael was an act of faith as real as leaving Ur, perhaps even more painful. Abraham has just let go of a son. The pain of that early morning has not yet subsided. But God is about to ask him for something that will make saying goodbye to Ishmael seem bearable. Because this time, he will not ask him to let go of a son. He will ask him to kill him. What is about to happen on Mount Moriah is the most extreme moment of faith recorded in the Bible. If you want to be there when the outcome is revealed, subscribe now. This is the test that sealed an eternal friendship. The years following Isaac's birth were likely the most fulfilling in Abraham's life. He watched the son of the promise grow up, taught him to love Jehovah, and told him the story of the altars, the stars, and the covenant. Isaac became a strong, obedient, faithful young man. He was about 25 years old when the night came that changed everything. "Abraham," called Jehovah. "Here I am." The words that followed were the hardest Abraham had ever heard in his entire life. "Please take your son, your only son whom you love so much, Isaac, and make a journey to the land of Moriah, and there offer him as a burnt offering." Notice how Jehovah phrased the request. He did not simply say, "your son." He said, "your only son." Then he added, "whom you love so much." And then he used the word, "please." God knew exactly what he was asking. He knew the weight of every word. And yet he asked it because he had a reason that Abraham could not see at that moment. That sacrifice would foreshadow the day when God himself would give up his beloved son to save humanity. But Abraham knew nothing of that. He only knew what he felt, a pain that must have torn his heart apart. Isaac was the son he had waited 25 years for, the son whom God himself had miraculously given him, the son through whom all the promises would come. How could God ask him to kill him? And yet, the Bible says something extraordinary about what Abraham did. He rose early in the morning. He didn't wait. He didn't negotiate. He didn't make excuses. The next morning, before the sun had even begun to warm the air, he saddled his donkey, took 2 servants with him, cut the wood for the burnt offering, and set out on the journey with Isaac by his side. A 3-day journey.
3 days with the weight of what he was about to do crushing his heart. 3 days watching his son walk beside him, listening to his voice, seeing his face. Did Abraham sleep any of those nights? Did he weep silently while Isaac rested? The account doesn't say. But it does tell us something revealing. When they came near the place, Abraham said to the servants, "Stay here with the donkey, but the boy and I will go over there, worship, and return to you." Return to you. Plural. Both of them. Was he lying to them? No. Hebrews 11:19 explains that Abraham considered that God was able to raise him even from the dead. After decades of experiences with God, after seeing Sarah give birth at 90, after every trial overcome, Abraham had reached an unshakable conclusion. God always keeps his promises. If he had promised descendants through Isaac, then Isaac would live, even if he had to be raised from the dead. Abraham's faith was not blind. It was the culmination of a lifetime of experiences with a God who never fails. Then the ascent up the mountain began, and at some point during that climb, Isaac broke the silence with a question that must have pierced his father like a spear, a question to which Abraham responded with the most extraordinary words a father has ever spoken, words that contained a truth he himself did not yet fully understand. "My father, here is the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham replied, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." They reached the summit. Abraham built an altar of stones.
He arranged the wood in order, and then he bound Isaac's hands and feet and laid him on the altar. Isaac, a young man of 25, was stronger than his father of 125. He could have resisted, but he did not. The son's faith honored the father's faith. Abraham stretched out his hand. He took the slaughtering knife. He raised it over his son. "Abraham! Abraham!" The angel of the Lord stopped his hand at the last moment. "Do not lay a hand on the boy. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught by its horns in a thicket. He sacrificed it in Isaac's place. Father and son embracing, trembling, weeping, alive. God knew even before asking for the sacrifice that he would not allow Isaac to die. He already had the ram waiting in the thicket. Sovereign and compassionate tenderness, that of one who never asks for anything without having already prepared the provision. And then God spoke once more. But this time it was not a promise. It was an oath. "By myself I swear that, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and multiply your descendants as the stars of the heavens and as the grains of sand on the seashore." The covenant was sealed with the highest guarantee in the universe, the Word of God backed by His own name. Abraham came down from Mount Moriah with his son alive and with something else, the absolute certainty that his friendship with God was unbreakable. He had given everything, and God had given him everything back. Abraham lived to be 175 years old. The Bible says he died old and full of years. He never saw the great nation that God had promised him. He never set foot as an owner on the land he had walked through for a century. He lived his entire life in tents, as a stranger in a land that his descendants would inherit centuries after his death. And yet, he died content. Because Abraham did not measure his life by what he had received, but by the one with whom he had shared it. Sarah had died before him at the age of 127, Abraham mourned her passing and bought the cave of Machpelah to bury her, the only piece of land he ever owned in his entire life. Then he made sure that Isaac married a woman who loved the Lord, and Rebekah came as the answer to that search. Abraham was able to close his eyes knowing that the promise continued. But the most extraordinary thing about Abraham's life was not his achievements. It was a title. Centuries after his death, the prophet Isaiah recorded God's words, "Abraham, my friend." And the disciple James confirmed it. Abraham was called a friend of the Lord. In the entire Bible, no other human being receives that title in such a direct and personal way. And that is the question this story leaves us with. What did God see in Abraham to call him his friend? From Abraham, we learn that faith is demonstrated by obeying without seeing the full picture, that generosity comes from trusting that God will provide, that courage springs from truly knowing God, and that humility allows us to get back up after every mistake. But without a doubt, the most significant lesson for our times is this: God does not choose perfect people as friends. He chooses people who always return to Him. Let's think about what Abraham did wrong. He lied about Sarah in Egypt out of fear. He accepted Hagar's proposal out of impatience. God had to correct him and tell him to listen to his wife. He laughed when God promised him a son because it seemed impossible to him. He was an imperfect man. He made mistakes that had real and painful consequences. And yet, Jehovah called him my friend. Why? Because after every mistake, Abraham returned to the altar. After Egypt, he returned to Bethel and prayed. After the complication with Hagar, he continued to listen to God. After laughing at the promise, he was circumcised that very day without further question. Abraham wasn't perfect, but he was persistent. His faith wasn't perfect, but it was unshakable. And that is exactly what God values. What does this mean for you today? It means that if you've ever made a mistake in your spiritual life, if you've felt like you failed, that you didn't measure up, that your faith wasn't enough, Abraham's story tells you something clear. Jehovah hasn't discarded you. God doesn't seek perfection. He seeks a heart that keeps coming back to Him. Perhaps you are facing a difficult decision today, such as leaving something comfortable and secure to obey God, just as Abraham left Ur. Perhaps you are waiting for something God promised, but that is slow in coming, just as Abraham waited 25 years for Isaac. Perhaps you are dealing with the consequences of a bad decision, just as Abraham dealt with the conflict that Hagar brought. Or perhaps God is asking you to let go of something you love deeply, just as Abraham let go of Ishmael and was willing to offer up Isaac. Whatever your situation, the lesson is the same. Do not stop walking with God. Do not stop returning to the altar. Do not stop trusting that the God who created the stars Abraham counted that night is the same God who is looking at you right now. And if you keep walking with Him, step by step, trial after trial, mistake after mistake, faith after faith, Jehovah will see in you the same thing He saw in Abraham. Do you dare to build that kind of friendship with God? Yes, you too can be called a friend of God.
If you enjoyed this content, subscribe so you don't miss the next inspiring Bible story.